My name is Alyssa Parker. I'm 30 years old, and I am the CEO of Orion Creative, a marketing firm with offices in 3 major states across the country. From the outside, people see success-polished presentations, sharp blazers, and a company jet. But what they don't see is the journey that began with me standing alone in the rain, cast out by the very people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. 12 years ago, my mother told me I was no longer her daughter. I was born and raised in Charlotte, North Carolina, in a family where status was currency and appearances were everything. My father, Philip Parker, worked as a senior partner at a powerful financial firm. He was a man of few words, always impeccably dressed, and almost always absent physically present but emotionally distant. My mother, Evelyn Parker, was the true architect of our family's reputation. Her life revolved around climbing the endless ladders of high society. And I quickly learned that love in our house was not something freely given. It was a reward for compliance. Growing up, my days were a carefully curated performance. I wore the dresses she picked, attended the galas she arranged, and walked the paths she paved. I wasn't Alyssa. I was Evelyn's project, a vessel through which she could solidify her place among the city's elite. But no matter how tightly she tried to control me, I always had questions. I always had my own dreams. And I always said no when it mattered. The final fracture came when she introduced me to Leonard Sutton. Leonard was the son of Charles Sutton, one of my mother's most critical business allies. He was 17 years older than me, a man whose wealth and lineage masked the uncomfortable stories that circulated quietly behind closed doors, stories of manipulation, questionable business practices, and a failed engagement that ended under suspicious circumstances. I heard the whispers, but my mother dismissed them as envy from those beneath us. For her, Leonard wasn't just a suitable match. He was the cornerstone of her long-term social strategy. If I married him, Evelyn's influence would be sealed for decades. She saw it as a brilliant arrangement. I saw it as a prison. When I refused, her mask finally slipped. She wasn't just disappointed, she was furious. Her ambition didn't have room for rebellion, not from me. In her eyes, I wasn't a daughter. I was a failed investment. "You will regret this," she said, her voice shaking but her stance cold and unyielding. And then, she told me to get out. No suitcase, no safety net, no second chance. I walked out of that house with only my purse, my phone, and the faint hope that there might be a life outside the blueprint she had forced upon me. It took me years to rebuild from nothing. But the thing my mother never understood is, some of us are not meant to be owned. Some of us are meant to fly. I stepped out of that house with nothing but a small purse and a phone, walking away from the only life I had known. But I didn't yet understand that my mother wasn't finished with me. She had one last move to make, one last attempt to tether me to the life she had so carefully constructed. 2 weeks after our explosive argument, my mother invited me to what she called a small family dinner to celebrate my birthday. I almost didn't go. Part of me knew there would be nothing simple or sincere about that invitation. But something inside me, a naive trace of hope that perhaps we could salvage what was left, pushed me to accept. Maybe I thought this was her way of making peace. When I arrived at the estate, everything felt carefully staged. The driveway was lined with luxury cars, more than I expected for a supposed intimate dinner. The house, always pristine, had been transformed into a ballroom, adorned with golden decorations and crystal chandeliers. There were at least 100 guests, family acquaintances, business partners, members of the local elite. My mother had spared no expense. She greeted me at the door with a carefully practiced smile, kissed my cheek like nothing had happened, and whispered, "Try to behave tonight. Darling, this is important." I should have walked away right then. Every fiber of my being screamed that something was wrong. But I stayed. The first hour passed in a blur of formalities, polite conversations with distant relatives, half-hearted birthday wishes from people who barely knew me. My father, as always, hovered on the edges of the room, his silence louder than any words. He wouldn't meet my eyes. And then Leonard Sutton arrived. I hadn't seen him since the last disastrous dinner, but there he was, impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, moving through the crowd like a man who already owned the room. His confidence wasn't charming. It was suffocating. When he reached me, he kissed my hand and called me my beautiful Alyssa, as though we shared some unspoken understanding. I stiffened, but he acted as if he didn't notice. Dinner was served at a long banquet table that looked more like a stage than a place to share a meal. As I sat between my mother and Leonard, I realized the entire night had been orchestrated for this one moment. I was the main act, and I hadn't even known I was performing. After dessert, my mother stood and tapped her glass for attention. The room quieted. "Thank you all for joining us to celebrate Alyssa's special day," she began, her voice sweet but brimming with expectation. "Tonight, we also have another joyous announcement." I turned to her, my heart pounding. Leonard rose to his feet, stepped in front of me, and to my horror, dropped to one knee. A spotlight, as if perfectly timed, illuminated us. "Alyssa Parker," he said loudly, pulling a velvet box from his pocket. "Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" The room erupted in applause. Guests smiled, some already raising their glasses. My mother beamed, her hands clasped in triumph. My father looked away. I couldn't breathe. Leonard opened the box to reveal a diamond so large it seemed to weigh down the air around me. He smiled not with affection, but with the smug certainty of a man sealing a lucrative contract. I looked around, trapped under hundreds of expectant gazes. My mother's eyes bore into me, warning me of the consequences if I dared to refuse. I stood. Slowly, "No," I said, my voice cutting through the applause like glass shattering on marble. The silence was instant and absolute. Leonard's face twitched in disbelief. "I'm sorry. What did you say?" I said no. I repeated, louder this time. "I will not marry you." Whispers rippled through the room. My mother's face blanched, then quickly flushed with rage. "Alyssa," she hissed under her breath, "you're making a scene. I'm making a choice," I replied firmly, one that should have always been mine to make. Leonard's expression darkened, but it was my mother's reaction that scorched itself into my memory. She slapped me across the face, hard and fast, in front of everyone. The sound echoed in the stunned silence. "You are no longer my daughter," she spat, her voice trembling with fury. "Get out." No one moved to stop me. No one followed me out. Even my father simply dropped his gaze to the floor, as though I no longer existed. I walked away from that house, from that party, from that carefully built empire of control. That night, I didn't just walk away from my family, I walked toward myself. I walked away from that house, from that party, from everything that had defined me for 20 years. But what no one tells you is that after the dramatic exit, after the door slams shut behind you, the silence that follows is deafening. There were no bright lights waiting for me, no safe place ready to catch me. There was just the cold, unfamiliar street and the crushing weight of being truly alone. The first person I thought to call was Nina Crawford. Nina had been my closest friend since middle school, though my mother had always treated her with thinly veiled disdain. Nina's family was working class. Her father was a mechanic, her mother a school cafeteria cook. In my mother's eyes, Nina was a bad influence, someone beneath our station. But Nina was the only person who had ever seen me, not the perfect daughter, not the social puppet, just me. When she picked up the phone that night, I could barely get the words out. "I have nowhere to go," I whispered, my throat raw from holding back tears. Without hesitation, she told me to come over. For the first 2 months, I slept on Nina's worn-out sofa in her cramped apartment. She never made me feel like a burden, even though we both knew I was. I applied to a community college nearby, using the high school transcripts I had managed to grab before my mother threw me out. Tuition was a mountain I wasn't sure I could climb, but I enrolled anyway. desperate to cling to any part of the future I had once imagined for myself. I took whatever work I could find. In the mornings, I waited tables at a greasy diner, my uniform always smelling faintly of burnt coffee. In the afternoons, I delivered takeout orders on a battered bicycle, racing between crowded streets for tips that barely covered my meals. At night, I cleaned office buildings, scrubbing floors and emptying trash cans in the same kinds of skyscrapers where I'd once imagined myself as a successful professional. Sleep became a luxury I could no longer afford. I stole hours on the bus, between shifts, and sometimes during brief moments of stillness in stairwells. Things went from hard to brutal when I was scammed out of my first month's rent by a landlord who vanished the day I was supposed to move in. I had already given him my deposit, everything I had saved, with nowhere else to go. I spent several nights sleeping at the central bus terminal, clutching my backpack to my chest, pretending to be waiting for a ride so the security guards wouldn't kick me out. There were moments I almost called home. I memorized my mother's number again and again, my thumb hovering over the call button, wondering if she would even answer. But I never pressed it. I knew the price of going back would be my freedom. Then came the morning that changed everything. I was delivering coffee to an office building downtown when I ran into a particularly difficult customer. He was berating the barista at the counter for a simple mistake cream instead of milk. When I stepped in to calmly offer a replacement and handled the situation with a level of patience I barely felt, a woman at the next table watched the entire exchange. She was striking elegant, poised, but with kind eyes that studied me carefully. As I turned to leave, she stopped me. "What's your name?" she asked. "Alyssa," I answered, wondering if I had somehow offended her. She handed me her card. "Sophia Mitchell. I'm the creative director at Apex Strategies." "You handled that man better than some of my managers could have." I stared at the card, unsure what to say. "Do you have any marketing experience?" she continued. "No," I admitted honestly. "But I'm studying business at the community college." She smiled. "We have an unpaid internship position open. It's mostly grunt work, copying, organizing files, answering phones. But if you're willing to work hard, you might learn something." I accepted without hesitation. The next 6 months were some of the hardest of my life. I juggled my 3 jobs, night classes, and the internship, often falling asleep at the office on a pile of marketing drafts. I worked 3 times harder than everyone else. Not because I wanted recognition I was invisible in that company, but because failure was not an option. I couldn't afford it. I showered at the gym across the street, ate instant noodles for dinner, and spent my nights studying campaign strategies I didn't yet fully understand. But I was finally moving forward. And for the first time since walking away from my family, I believed that maybe I would survive. Surviving was no longer enough. Somewhere along the sleepless nights and endless shifts, I realized I wanted more than to simply stay afloat. I wanted to build something of my own. I wanted a life that wasn't just about running from the past, but creating a future on my terms. Sophia Mitchell became more than my boss. She became my mentor, my protector, and in many ways, the mother figure I had never truly had. She didn't hand me opportunities, I earned them, but she made sure I was seen. She taught me everything: how to craft persuasive campaigns, how to understand consumer behavior, and most importantly, how to stand my ground in a world that didn't welcome people like me. She pushed me ruthlessly, not out of cruelty, but because she saw something in me that I had nearly forgotten the fire I thought my mother had extinguished. In my 3rd year under Sophia's guidance, I found the courage to start my own company. I named it Orion Creative, a nod to the constellation that had quietly guided me home on so many nights when I walked the streets alone. The stars had been constant, even when nothing else was. I didn't have investors. I didn't have connections. What I had was a borrowed laptop, a rented desk in a shared workspace, and a vision to help small businesses succeed in a digital world that often ignored them. At first, no one took me seriously. Competitors laughed at me, clients dismissed me. I pitched to anyone who would listen. Most didn't, but I kept showing up. I kept refining my proposals. I kept learning. And then I met Ethan Reed. Ethan owned a small chain of local coffee shops that had been struggling to keep up with larger franchises. He had built his business from the ground up, pouring his savings, energy, and heart into every store. I admired that instantly. Our first meeting was in one of his quieter locations, a cozy place with scuffed wooden floors and a chalkboard menu. He listened carefully as I outlined how I could help him modernize his brand, reach younger audiences, and bring his community-focused values to life through social media. I expected him to hesitate. I expected the usual skepticism. Instead, he smiled and said, "Let's do it." He didn't just sign a contract, he believed in me. The campaign we built together became the turning point. Foot traffic to his shops tripled in 6 months. Word spread, not just about Ethan's coffee, but about the girl with the scrappy little marketing agency who got results. Suddenly, I had more clients than I could handle. Ethan became a frequent collaborator and eventually, much more. He never tried to manage me, never questioned my ambition. He was simply there, solid, steady. The quiet kind of support I had never known in my family. We talked about our dreams over late-night coffees, about the kind of life we wanted to build, one where neither of us would have to sacrifice who we were. Our partnership deepened naturally. The day we signed our first $1 million contract, Ethan surprised me by bringing me to a rooftop overlooking the city skyline. He pulled out a small, simple ring. "I know you don't care about grand gestures," he said softly, "and you don't need anyone's permission to lead your life. But I would love to walk beside you, if you'll have me." There was no pressure, no plan to trap me, no empire building behind his proposal, just two people choosing each other. I said yes. When our daughter, Sophie Reed, was born a year later, I felt something I had never experienced as a child: peace. She had Ethan's calm eyes and my relentless energy. I held her tiny hand in mine and made her a silent promise she would always know she was enough, just as she was. I would never build walls around her the way my mother had built them around me. Balancing motherhood and running a growing company wasn't easy. I brought Sophie to the office in the early days, converting a storage room into a makeshift nursery. My staff, many of whom were young, ambitious, and fiercely loyal, adjusted to meetings occasionally interrupted by a baby's cries. Our home was modest, but it was ours, a place where no one dictated who we should be. I had built a company, a family, and a life I loved on my own terms. For a long time, I believed I had fully left my past behind. But life has a way of circling back to unfinished stories, and mine was about to knock on my door. I had spent years believing I had outrun my past, carefully building a life so full, so meaningful, that I thought the old ghosts would never find me again. But they always do. Sometimes they come quietly, through the innocent questions of a child. It started with Sophie. One evening, as I tucked her into bed, she asked, "Mommy, why don't I have grandparents like my friends do?" Her best friend at school had 4 2-sets who doted on her, brought her gifts, took her to the park. Sophie had none, at least none she had met. I had shielded her from that part of my story for so long, I almost forgot that children don't accept silence forever. I tried to brush it off. "You have Grandma Sophia," I said, referring to my mentor, who had long become our chosen family. "But what about the other ones? Where are your mommy and daddy?" Her question landed like a stone in my chest. I told her, as gently as I could, that they lived far away. But Sophie, like me, had never been satisfied with half-truths. Her curiosity lingered, and so did my guilt. Not long after, I received an email from a distant cousin I hadn't spoken to in over a decade. The message was brief. My father had suffered a mild stroke. He was stable, but the family was struggling. Medical bills were piling up. The fortune my parents had once proudly flaunted was apparently gone, chipped away by quiet financial disasters no one had shared with me. For the first time in 12 years, I typed my parents' names into a search bar. My father's once prominent firm had significantly downsized. His name was no longer listed among the partners. My mother, Alyssa Parker, still appeared in society pages, still attended charity galas. But the pictures told a different story. Fewer events, fewer extravagant displays. And then there was the house, the one I had left in the rain, with nothing but a purse and a broken heart. I found it on a real estate website, still standing but noticeably aged. The pristine lawn was now patchy and overgrown. The grand white columns needed repainting. I couldn't explain why, but I felt the pull to return. When our company's board proposed opening a new branch in Charlotte, the numbers made perfect sense, but I knew it wasn't just about business. It was about facing the place that had once exiled me. I made the decision quietly. Ethan supported me without hesitation. He understood that this was something I needed to do, even if I wasn't sure I was ready. I didn't tell my parents I was coming. I needed to see their unguarded reaction to know, with absolute certainty, whether I was still invisible to them or whether time had softened the edges of their pride. Sophie was ecstatic about the trip, especially when she learned we would fly on the company jet. Our own airplane. She squealed, pressing her face to the window as we soared above the clouds. I watched her with a tightness in my chest, wondering what she would find at the end of this journey. When we landed in Charlotte, I rented a black sedan and drove through streets that felt eerily smaller than I remembered. The neighborhoods were familiar, but the magic they once held for me had long evaporated. The house looked exactly as the photos had promised, faded, tired, but still standing tall in its stubborn way. "Is this where you grew up?" Mommy Sophie asked, her little voice full of wonder as she gazed out the car window. "Yes." "Sweetheart," I said quietly. "This was my home." "It's pretty," she said, with the simple generosity of a child. I sat in the car for several minutes, gripping the steering wheel as memories flooded me: birthdays, piano lessons, the cold silence of dinners where I was expected to perform, not speak. Finally, I helped Sophie out of her car seat and walked with her to the front door. I rang the doorbell, the same overly ornate chime I remembered. It was my mother who opened the door. For a moment, she simply stared, as though she was seeing a ghost. Her perfectly composed face crumpled in a way I had never seen before. "Alyssa," she whispered. I held Sophie's hand tightly. "Hi, Mom." Her gaze drifted to the child at my side, her breath catching audibly. "Who is this?" "This is Sophie," I said steadily. "Your granddaughter." Something broke in her expression, a mix of shock, regret, and something else I couldn't quite name. Behind her, my father appeared in the hallway, slower than I remembered, a cane in his left hand. His eyes filled with tears the moment he saw me. For the first time in my life, he reached for me without hesitation. Would you like to come in?" he asked, his voice trembling. And just like that, after 12 years of silence, I stepped over the threshold of the house I had once been thrown out of, not as a runaway child, but as a mother, a leader, and a woman who had built her life from the ground up. The moment I stepped through the doorway, I realized I wasn't the same girl who had left all those years ago. I was no longer someone seeking approval, no longer someone willing to shrink herself to fit inside someone else's life plan. I had come back not to ask for forgiveness, not to reclaim a place I'd outgrown, but to set the terms for whatever came next. The initial hours of that first visit were careful, as if we were all tiptoeing around the sharp edges of our history. My father offered me tea, his hands trembling slightly as he poured. My mother kept stealing glances at Sophie, as though she were still trying to process the existence of this child who bore my stubborn chin and Ethan's calm eyes. Sophie, untouched by the weight of our past, wandered freely through the house, pausing to admire a crystal figurine on the coffee table. My father surprised me by letting her hold it. Your mother loved this one when she was your age, he told her softly. That first conversation didn't go deep. It wasn't meant to. There were too many unspoken things, too many years stacked between us like locked doors. But before I left that day, I made my position clear. If we are going to have a relationship, I told them, there must be boundaries. They both looked at me then. Really looked, not as a daughter to control, not as a rebellious child, but as the woman I had become. First, I said, steady and calm, Sophie will always have the freedom to choose her own path. You will never try to shape her into something she isn't. She is not a project. She is not a bargaining chip. My father nodded immediately. My mother's lips tightened, but she said nothing. Second, Ethan and I are partners in life, in work, in everything. There is no hierarchy in our marriage. He does not own me. No one does. My mother blinked, surprised, but she stayed silent. Third, I'm opening a new office here. Dad, I want you to work with us. Not out of pity, but because your skills are valuable. You'll be treated like any other employee, with the same expectations. His eyes glistened with something I hadn't seen before: pride, maybe, or relief. I would like that, he said, his voice rough. For months, we moved carefully through this new arrangement. My mother struggled the most. Control had been her language for so long that she fumbled when she could no longer speak it. Old habits surfaced, passive-aggressive comments, small jabs disguised as concern. I called them out gently but firmly, each time reinforcing the new rules of engagement. Eventually, she began to soften. It wasn't a transformation overnight. It was in the small things: a question asked instead of a demand, a hesitation before offering an opinion. Slowly, she began to see me not as her failure, but as her equal. During one particularly tense dinner, when she commented on Sophie's undisciplined behavior for laughing too loudly at the table, I finally stopped pretending we could keep skating over the cracks. Mom, I said, if we are going to build anything real from this, you need to take responsibility for what happened. You need to acknowledge what you did. Her defenses rose immediately. I've already said I was wrong about Leonard. That's not enough. I cut in, my voice quiet but firm. You threw me out. You chose your social plan over your daughter. You need to understand how deeply that cut me, and how that scar never fully goes away. The silence stretched, taut and uncomfortable. Ethan gently took Sophie outside to give us space. My mother stared at her plate for a long time before finally speaking. I was terrified, she admitted, her voice trembling in a way I had never heard. I wanted to protect you from the hard life I had before marrying your father. I thought security would fix everything. I thought love was something you could build through arrangement, through power, through structure. She looked up at me, tears visible but unshed. I was wrong. I see that now. And I'm sorry. I am so sorry. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was the first honest thing she had ever said to me about us. Over time, I suggested family therapy. To my surprise, they agreed. Through those sessions, I learned about the rigid, loveless household my mother had grown up in, about the emotional weight she carried into adulthood, and about the expectations that had shaped my father's quiet compliance. Understanding their pain didn't excuse their choices, but it helped me see them as human, not the architects of my suffering, but the flawed, frightened people behind it. 1 year after we reconnected, we celebrated Sophie's 6th birthday, not at their formal dining table, but at a sunlit park with messy picnic blankets and too many balloons. Sophie ran across the grass, shrieking with laughter as she showed my father how to use the monkey bars. His suit jacket quickly became smudged with dirt, but he didn't care. Ethan sat beside me on a worn bench, watching our daughter command the playground with her usual fearless energy. "Penny, for your thoughts," he asked. "I was just thinking how different this is from the family I grew up in. I said, and how grateful I am that we built something better. As we cut the birthday cake, my mother raised her camera and told us to gather for a photo. Old instincts surfaced. She adjusted my hair, repositioned Ethan's shoulders, straightened Sophie's dress. But then she caught herself. "You don't have to smile if you don't want to, Alyssa," she said softly. "The picture will be beautiful either way." It was a small thing, but in that moment, I knew the cycle had finally been broken. I didn't need her permission to be myself. Not anymore. The past didn't vanish, but it lost its power to define me. I am not here to perform. I am not here to prove anything. I stood up from the picnic blanket, brushing the grass from my skirt, and took Ethan's hand as we walked towards Sophie. The sun was warm on my back. The path ahead wide open. Some stories don't need applause to matter. Some victories don't need to be seen to be real, because true worth does not require recognition. And dignity mine. Yours can never be taken away.